Oh, good morning to those of you in the US and good afternoon to our friends in Europe and Israel. On behalf of the Global Interdependence Center, welcome to today's executive briefing, which is held in partnership with Ariel University in memory of Mr. David Dralick. I'm Bill Kennedy, the GIC's Vice Chair of Programs, and I will serve as moderator today. Rising food inflation and food security are two related themes of growing importance. The Financial Times recently reported that global food prices have increased by the biggest margin in a decade. In May, the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization's monthly index rose 40% year over year, heightening fears of yet another pandemic-stoked supply chain disruption. So today, we want to explore food supply and demand dynamics with two very special guests. Dr. Vered Kaufman is an epidemiologist and a registered dietitian serving on the faculty at the School of Health Sciences in the Department of Nutrition Sciences at Ariel University in Israel. Also, she serves as an affiliated scientist at the Center for Urban Health Solutions at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto, Canada. Dr. Kaufman's research focuses on investigating social, economic, and environmental causes of nutrition-related chronic diseases among various populations, and she is strongly committed to conducting research that informs public health policy. Brandon Zick is the Chief Investment Officer of Ceres Partners, a private equity firm that invests in farmland across 10 states in the US. In his role as CIO, Mr. Zick supervises valuation analysis, tenant management, and acquisition due diligence and negotiations. Prior to joining Ceres, Mr. Zick served at Morgan Stanley and Lehman Brothers, including some time in Japan. Mr. Zick is a chartered alternative investment analyst. He's a graduate of the University of Notre Dame with a bachelor's in finance and a concentration in Japanese language. Mr. Zick grew up on a family dairy and crop farm in northeastern Pennsylvania, giving him full bona fides to join us today. Dr. Kaufman, Brandon, welcome to you both and welcome to the executive briefing.
Thank you.
So Brandon, thank you very much. And we're going to ask you to start. So we'll have you present first on a global perspective on agricultural trade trends. So we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you everyone for joining. As Bill said, I'm going to start just by talking through some of the macro themes in the global grain space. Just a brief summary, we have two strategies here at Ceres Partners. One of them is to invest in farmland, and the other is in agricultural businesses. And I'll touch on that a little later. But as you said, we own just over $1 billion worth of farmland in the US across 10 states. That's almost 150,000 acres of land focused on row and specialty crops that are farmed by over 140 family farmers that are tenants of ours on our properties. As we talk about global grains, I think it's really important to set the stage for who's producing grain globally and then who are the buyer of these grains. I think there's generally a misconception of how much grain there is in the world sitting in inventories. I think some people tend to believe that there's 3 or 4 years worth of grain sitting in piles or grain bins somewhere in the world that as it's needed, it can just be moved around pretty easily to the consumers of that product. But in fact, grain inventories usually find themselves within the range of 8 to 15% of annual global use. So what that means is you have 1 to 2 months of grain supplies that are out there. So any supply disruption that happens in any of the large growing regions of the world can pretty quickly lead to increases in commodity prices and thereby kind of food scarcity, especially in regions of the world that don't have the kind of economic wherewithal to be able to go out and pay higher prices for grain. So I'm going to focus this morning on corn and soybeans as two of the largest grain crops that are produced. It should come as no surprise to anyone that The United States is the largest producer of corn in the world and the second largest producer of soybeans. It probably does come as a surprise to folks that China is the second largest producer of corn globally. That should be surprising because China's not in the export market. US and Brazil and Argentina are the largest exporters of corn, and China's not there because they're actually the largest consumer of corn outside of the US, and they actually import some corn as well. Usually when you think of China and grain imports, you've heard the statistic that 2/3 of every soybean that is grown anywhere in the world is usually purchased and consumed in China. Most of that is for livestock feed or hog feed, and that's what corn is used for as well. So what you have is a dynamic globally where a handful of countries produce most of the grain in the world, and then it gets exported to most of the non-producing countries. And that's what creates this global trade system. And China is a huge part of that today, both for the US and for other parts of the world like South America and the former Soviet Union. But there are also other large grain buyers that come into the market when they have production disruptions, or also as their population continues to grow, and not only grow in terms of size, but one thing that we've seen throughout the last 15 years, substantially, and even 20 years, is the increase in grain demand overall. And that's happened because not only do you have population growing, but more people moving out of poverty and into the world's middle class, where not only do they want to eat more food, but they want to eat better food. And when I say better food, I'm generally talking about more protein consumption. So since 2000 and 2001, you've seen consumption of corn in the world, which is a large feed grain, nearly double. And you've seen consumption of soybeans more than double during that time. A big portion of that has come from China, as the emerging middle class has really taken flight there. Citizens want to eat in that 300 million 300 million people that have moved into the middle class. They want to eat not just more food, but better food, maybe eating meat or protein twice a week as opposed to once a week, or moving from chicken and poultry to pork and beef, which is a higher conversion rate of grains to that protein. So this creates an interesting dynamic in the world where you have demand continuing to grow, and the question is, can supply keep up with that over the long term? If you want to look at trade flows, this is a good example of where all the grains, and this would also include wheat here as a large large grain that's traded globally, where are they produced and where are they consumed? So you can see the three largest producers of grains by weight are South America, North America, and then the former Soviet Union countries. And the largest consumers by far come from Asia and the Middle East. That has been the way, that this has been kind of the standard for quite some time, but the percentage of which those grains are consumed by Asia and the Middle East have continued to grow. And that's actually putting a lot of pressure on the supply system. And if you think back to 2012 and 13, we had a time period of very high commodity prices, which was caused generally by this demand increasing, but it was exacerbated by some supply disruptions right here in the US. In some of the highest productivity land in the world, we had what was kind of a historic drought, which led to very high commodity prices, which also led to a lot of issues just globally from a food standpoint. One way that most people would say, how do you combat this and the supply disruptions along with the increasing demand, would be, how can technology help increase yields? And historically, yield productivity or yield growth has always been able to keep up, and in some cases exceed, the demand growth that's been out there. And that's why a bushel of corn today, while higher than it was 50 years ago, has not kept up with inflation. And prices have still been able to maintain in somewhat of a reasonable bandwidth because of yield increases. But what we've seen over the last 30 years is that yield increases, while still present, have started to decline. And you can see in these trend lines for both corn and soybeans that all the seed technology and agricultural technology that's been used to farm more efficiently and try to increase yields, while they still increase every year, it's at a declining rate. And that makes this idea that a 9 billion in global population wanting to eat more and better food is actually going to be very difficult to achieve over time. And so that can lead to both commodity price surges as well as uncertain or scarcity on the supply side. And this really, this next slide really shows you how that's manifested. When you have demand outpacing yield, that's going to lead to increasing prices over time. And that's going to have to lead to substitution, or people or countries pulling back on what they can feed for both dairy, pork, beef, poultry production, all of those things. It's going to lead to scarcity over time. Here's a great chart that shows just the type of price volatility and history that we've had over the last 30 years through this complex of corn, soybeans, and wheat. I had mentioned in 2012 and 13 there was a big spike due to a drought, and you can see now into 2020 and 21 we've been coming off what we would consider a down cycle for commodity prices. When prices started to come down in 2012 and 13, they came from nearly record levels, and they came down pretty quickly for a few reasons. One was that some demand was destroyed. So users of grain like biodiesel and ethanol, with where the price of oil and diesel fuel were, some of that usage came out. You also had big protein producers culling their herds and flocks because it was uneconomic to continue to feed their livestock or poultry at these higher grain prices. And that demand destruction was also coupled with increases in supply. And here in the United States, we're blessed with some of the best soil, the best water resources, particularly in the Midwest, and farmers using the latest technology so that they can maximize yields. But within the U.S., there's no incremental acres that can be added to meet demand. In other parts of the world, there are incremental acres that can be added. And some of those acres, when you have high prices, the price signal is telling them that it's time to come into production. So that's why you see the cerrado and parts of the rainforest be converted to cropland in Brazil, in sub-Saharan Africa, some land coming into production. And that cycle is what led to lower commodity prices and kind of more of a baseline or streamline from 2014 until 2019. And again, a supply disruption in South America, and also a kind of an epic failure of a crop of corn in China last year has led to the prices we have today, which are trending up and are not quite where they were in 2013 and 14, but are very strong. And that's going to play into this inflation theme that'll manifest itself throughout the food system over time. But it starts with the feed grains, because not only are they the grain that goes into food, they're the grain that your food eats if you're eating protein. This is just a point I wanted to make on how do you combat those higher prices? How do you increase supply of grains? In other regions of the world, it's possible to add kind of incremental or swing acres when there's a correct price signal or an adequate price signal. In the United States, that's not possible. Roughly every acre of land that could be farmed is farmed or is in some type of conservation program that'll keep it out of farming. And you also have development that continues to happen throughout the Midwest and other rural areas, whether it's highways, transmission lines, things like solar or expansions of towns and other types of development. U.S. farmable acres have continued to decline for the last 50 to 60 years. And we're even seeing kind of in the economic upturn, we've had even more development happening. So as this data becomes more available for 2018 through 2021, I continue to expect that U.S. tillable or arable land acres will decline further. And I think that'll continue over time. So those are some of the larger trends that we look at. It's one of the reasons why we're an investor of land. We think that over time, land is going to be a very scarce resource, or especially land that's suitable for farming, along with water as kind of the two large scarce resources that are out there. Bill mentioned that we have a private equity strategy, and I think this will kind of tee in nicely to what Professor Kaufman's going to talk about. But when you're dealing with scarce resources, there are ways to combat that. And for specific crops, it's going to make a lot of sense. So we try to focus on smaller companies using technologies that are off the shelf or proven, that try to lead to more sustainable solutions and that can help combat problems that we see overall. So we look at areas like indoor growing. That's not going to work for corn and soybeans. You're not going to convert 300 million acres of cropland for grains into greenhouses. But we do believe that for certain crops, especially crops that go direct to consumer, that's going to be really important. You're going to see an expansion of aquaculture, and water is always going to be a gating factor for global ag, because agriculture is the biggest user of water, and ways to prevent waste and overusage are really important. So these are areas we invest in. And I just want to give a quick example. One thing that we've looked to do and I think this is going to be replicated across a number of different crops, but for lettuce specifically here in the United States is blessed with California as one of the greatest growing regions in the world. It's the produce basket of the United States. But one of the problems you have with that region is now more water scarcity, trucking and shipping of these crops all across the United States. Food safety is a big thing overall, and the use of both hand labor and then a lot of pesticides and herbicides create things that the consumer doesn't necessarily want. So as you think about what do consumers want going forward, what are they willing to pay for, how do they increase the quality of the food that they eat, not just the quantity. One of the things we and others have done is to create indoor growing to reduce the use of natural resources, create a product with food traceability and some real sustainable attributes, and something that could be scaled over time. So I think there will be many more of these that are put in place over time for a number of different crops. You already see it in tomatoes and peppers and cucumbers, these direct-to-consumer produce items that quality matters and food traceability matters. And we're starting to see this now in the lettuce industry. And I continue to believe that other produce industry, other produce categories within the industry are going to move to this level. It takes a high amount of capital. It's very capital intensive to build these and do these, but over time for the higher revenue crops, we think it'll be very attractive for a number of people, and it will deal with some of the issues that we're talking about overall for food safety and scarcity and access to food in regions where it's more difficult to grow. So I'll pause there and turn it back to Bill.
Fantastic, Brandon. Thank you so much for sharing those thoughtful remarks and perspective. We're going to pivot and move away from that aspect of supply-demand dynamics and look a little bit more closely to the consumer. Dr. Kaufman's done a tremendous amount of research on labeling and food labeling specifically, and really looking forward to hearing her comments. So Dr. Kaufman, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you for the invitation to lecture today. So I'm going to speak today about consumers and professionals' perspective towards new food labeling in Israel. Why bothering, first of all? So unhealthy food intake is known and has been shown to contribute to more than 20% of death cases globally, mainly through non-communicable diseases such as diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, and other diseases such as cancer. And obesity in itself, as you can see here in this OECD graph, the prevalence of obesity, well, the United States have the unflattering position of being the first country in obesity rates, 40%, according to the OECD information from 2016. If you look for Israel, you can find Israel with 18.8% of obesity rates, unflattering as well, if you ask me. Japan has the best score here with 4% or almost 4%. So obesity rates are highly associated with non-communicable diseases. And if we look at the influence on the economy, so look at the left side of the graph here, the impact of overweight on the GDP is expected on average, on the OECD average, to cause a decrease, an average decrease of 3.3% in the GDP, looking into the future of 2050. If you include the United States in the G20 average, then it is 3.5%. Some of it, of course, is attributed due to the higher percentages of obesity. If you look into the right on health expenditures, which is another information or piece of expenditures that the country spends, then the percentages are even higher. So the OECD average is 8.4% of healthcare expenditures, which is attributed to overweight and obesity. So altogether, we're speaking about more than 10%. And some of it is attributed to GDP, other to health expenses, and that is without looking into the individual life expectancy, without looking into life quality and other aspects of obesity and health. So the OECD held consultation in what returns on investment in actions actually will give back to the economy. If you put $1 US investment in prevention of obesity, it is summed up to save $5.6 US. One of the main proposals on policy investment was to regulate advertising. Another one is food labeling. Although more modest, it has also been shown to attribute to help save the costs of obesity and influence the economy. So I'm going to focus today about the front of pack labeling. It is a policy tool for countries to improve the food environments in which food choices are made. And in saying that, there is a hope that if the food labeling, the front of pack labeling will be attractive, simple, informative, it will influence consumers, and that is an assumption that is not necessarily correct, as you may know, as you are consumers yourself. So the WHO recommended that governments will implement front of package nutrition labels differently, and hopefully that will reduce the intake of fast food, ultra-processed food, and other calorie-dense food. If we try to categorize the food label methodologies, we can cut them into two main methodologies. The first is informative, the second is judgmental. The informative one gives a lot of information, whereas when we are at the point of purchase, we'd like the consumer to make his or her decision very quickly. It's actually less than a second. So look at those icons, they may be more brief, more helpful than putting a lot of information. So at this minute, we'd like the lady to make a better decision or a healthier decision. If we look into the food labeling in the United States and in Canada, the old one, the new one, they're different obviously, but you can obviously see, and you know them probably, they contain a lot of information. Some of it is not clear to the public, some of it is clear but burdening, some of it is very understandable, but people don't want to look at it. The United States and Canada has made changes to the front of pack labeling. This is a new labeling in here. I'm going to share with you a short video demonstrating it.
Bold lines are definitely in.
And that clearly shows in the calories and serving size. pesticides.
Such a fresh look.
New information is listed, like potassium, added sugars.
That's something we just haven't seen from them before.
This latest piece from the House of FDA says so much.
It's speaking to me. See what's in it for you at fda.gov/new nutrition facts label.
That large, bold font for serving size brought down the house.
Talk about making a statement. Did you know that serving sizes are not a recommendation of how much to eat? They are actually...
I'm going to stop this now because the quality is not very high and return to the slideshow. But as you could notice previously, there are many details. How much sodium, how much saturated fat, how many calories are in the food label. All those details may or may not help consumers. And in any case, that needs to come with lots of explanations. It is not random that the FDA invested that much in videos and advertising of how do you read the new food labeling. So that is very detailed. As opposed to that, there are other methods that tried to be more judgmental. Here you can see the three colors, a traffic light, UK, food labeling. So whatever is red is obviously something to not to consume too much. Green is good for you, and orange, well, it is so-so. So in the UK, this is the methods are trying to implement. There is another method called the Nutri-Score. Nutri-Score actually emerged in North America. It is a very sophisticated scoring methodology that has been launched by David Katz from Yale. He's a physician and other well-known scientists, and they try to promote it in North America and in Europe. So far, they have succeeded implementing that partially in French and in other European countries. And some of the brands are related to this kind of food labeling. So 25% of the food items in Europe and in the 7 countries that are tied up, such as Spain and French and Italy, are being currently labeled in this system. If you look in depth into this system, though it is composed of the very detailed information that you've seen before in the USA, but it is not apparent to the consumers. The consumer will only see the colors. These are 5 colors. Try to make a consumer decide whether this food is good and healthy for him or her or not. If you look at the news, Europe is completely controversial whether or not this methodology works well or is something that Europeans would like to use. There is a huge fight in Italy on why, if at all, to implement this methodology. Here, I'd like to share this screen with you. So there is a fight, it splits the EU. The ham and the salami traditionally made in Italy are severely damaged from this label, and well, there is not a huge buy-in to this methodology, and there was no buy-in into this methodology in North America where it emerged. So a lot of emotions, a lot of traditions are tied into the food labeling and the new methods that has to do with how to label our food. If we go back to here, so this is a Nutri-Score, partially prevalent in European countries. In Chile, they came up with a highly, I think, or more clear colored, one color black actually signals to you that this food is high. You see high in sugar, high in fat, high in sodium, and high in calories. So the food is labeled in black. Black is not a very highly appealing color. It clearly indicates something that may not be good for you. So the Chilean system is labeling in black. When we came in Israel to think about how and what would we like to change in our food labeling, so our previous food labeling looked very much like this. Very informative, includes a lot of information, not helping consumers. So when the decision was made through 2017, 2018, Israel decided, the Ministry of Health and consultation committees that was held, decided to go and choose the warning front of package labeling in red, so high sodium, high sugar, high saturated fat, and positive front of package labeling green, so whatever food is signed up in green is supposed to be good for you. Prior to implementing this decision, we held a survey among dietitians and other health professionals and among the public on what do they think about the new food labeling to be introduced. So dietitians, a survey among dietitians, we asked them whether or not they believe that a red labeling will significantly reduce purchasing of the marked food. Majority indicated that they think food labeling in red will reduce food purchasing. When we asked them on which categories do you think that labeling will reduce the consumption, look at the blue bars. The orange bars actually represent a different survey. These surveys were not held together on different populations. The orange represents the public. We asked the public, how do you think the new food labeling will influence the purchasing of those categories of food? And what do you currently purchase? So currently, the public purchase mostly, you can see here, very high percentages of sweet snacks, savory snacks, sweet breakfast cereals, about 30%, processed meat, 50%, sweet and soft drink, more than almost 60%, and sweet dairy products, all 50 to 60%. So dietitian thought that the new food labeling, the red labeling, will mainly influence the sweet breakfast cereals, the sweet snacks, and the savory snacks, and soft drinks as well, and will less influence processed meat and sweet dairy product. Now, looking into this, it is really important to keep in mind who eats sweet breakfast cereals or sweet snacks or savory snacks. Maybe the answer is mainly everyone, because we look into the percentages, so 80% is a majority of the population, but children are mainly affected or mainly consume those foods. So if eventually children will consume less of these harmful foods, perhaps they will be healthier and less obese. This is the strategy Israel wanted to take. When we compare dietitians to others, this is from the survey we held at the Department of Nutrition Sciences at Ariel. So you can see that other health professionals think pretty much the same at most categories, whereas at some categories, they actually think that processed meat will be more affected than what dietitian thinks. This was significant here. And majority of dietitians and other think that the new food labeling will significantly reduce the purchasing of the marked food. Dietitian thought that it would influence more of the purchasing. Now, obviously, when you see this information, you can realize that manufacturers got really troubled from this information. They do not want their sales to be damaged in any way. That is understandable. When we look into segments of the population and what are their attitudes towards buying the red label foods, let me walk you through what we see here. First of all, on average, 64% declared they would purchase less food items with red labeling. So whether or not they're going to adhere to their declaration, a question, but at least that shows intentions. So households with children younger than 18, 72% thought they would buy less red labeled food. Once again, younger children, as in comparison to families with older adults, thought that they would consume less. And Arab households and ultra-Orthodox households, so two minority groups in the Israeli population, indicated they would purchase less food items with red labels. So what has Israel already did? The new Israeli food labeling has been launched in January 2020. What we see now is that manufacturers reformulated, changed the composition of food items to avoid red labels. Just to give you a little bit of insight, when we say reformulation, let's take the case of, for instance, trans fatty acids, right? They used to be oil. The manufacturers converted it through hydrogenation to margarine. That was the process that made trans fatty acids. I'm sure that when they've done it, they thought they've done a wonderful thing. It was cheap, it gave flavor to food, it was sustainable. So when you do reformulation procedures in the industry, you don't necessarily know what's going to happen. So to avoid the red labeling that is a result of items, food items high in sodium, high in saturated fat, high in sugar, manufacturers actually reduced or substituted these specific items in the food. What has been changed? It is yet too early to know. When we look into meta-analysis of food labeling and how does it affect on consumers and diet behaviors, we see here from a literature review across 60 studies and 11 countries that actually, if you look here, food labeling decreased consumers' intake of energy, total fat, and overall unhealthy dietary options by 30%, while increasing vegetable consumption by 13.5%. So it is actually a very good sign if that is going to happen in Israel. Perhaps people are going to eat less industrialized food or foods that actually is less healthy, and that's going to shift consumers' purchasing behaviors towards more fresh food, less processed food, and may end up in healthier individuals. So we have a few more questions when we look into it. So is food that is reformulated necessarily healthier? How do food labeling will influence children? Should babies' food be regulated differently than adult food? And how does food intake change by socioeconomic status and ethnicity? These are all open questions. We're now following into consumers' purchasing behaviors and look forward for more research that is being conducted now to see how exactly do consumers behave today as opposed to what they stated they would do in the past. So thank you everyone, and I will be happy to take questions later.
Thank you, Dr. Kaufman, and Brandon. We'll bring Brandon back online. So at this time, we'll turn to our audience Q&A. And I'd like to remind everyone that you can ask your question by going to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen on Zoom. Type in your question and we'll put it into the queue. We've had quite a few questions already. So why don't we just jump right in if we could. And Brandon, I'm going to put this first question to you. It has to do with the Phase 1 agreement that was negotiated between the US and China in February of 2020, right at the outbreak of the pandemic here in the United States. China was to purchase X billions of dollars of ag goods from the US. Any update on where that Phase 1 stands, and are there any changes? Can we expect any changes to US-China agricultural trade under the Biden administration?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think if you had asked me 10 years ago, what would a black swan event look like in U.S. agriculture, a trade war with China would have been very high on the list. U.S. exports 40% of what we produce, and China is one of the largest buyers of soybeans, pork, et cetera. And up until recently, they hadn't really been in the corn market. but because of supply disruptions that have occurred in China, they have been a big buyer of U.S. grains on the corn side as well. So they are tracking closer to those phase 1 targets. Phase 2 certainly seemed unattainable, but because China had a short domestic corn crop last year, and we also had production problems in Argentina, which limited exports for nearly 2 months, the U.S. was the only game in town to be the seller of corn to China. So there has been some progress there. I would expect with the new administration that they're going to be friendlier on trade with China than the Trump administration. But I don't know if the trade policy is really what's driving those purchases. I think it's need within China to replenish stocks because of the African swine flu issues they had, which decimated their pork production, and then the need to go and rebuild the grain stocks behind it. I think that's the real driver of what's happening on trade, much more so than any policy that's been put out there, or any trade agreements that were made.
Great, thank you for that. Dr. Kaufman, you've highlighted that the United States is number 1, unfortunately in a bad category, which was the most obese based on the definition that came from the OECD. Can you just share with us what is the definition of obesity?
Sure. Yeah, so in adults, we define obesity as BMI greater than 30. BMI is a body mass index, which is the weight in kilograms divided in the meters squared of the height. So a BMI greater than 30 is defined as obesity. And overweight is defined as BMI greater and equal to 25.
Excellent, thank you. Brandon, one of our participants is asking a question. If you had the ideal global data for measuring agricultural productivity, the comparisons across countries, across regions, what would that look like? And specifically, where do you see gaps in the data collection or the quality or comparison of the data from around the world?
Well, the ideal situation would be that it was accurate. I think we're a long way from that. And even in the United States, where the USDA does a lot of data collection, back in October, the USDA restated yields from 2018, pretty significantly down. And working closely with farmers who saw production during those years, and they never really believed the USDA data that was released in 2018. I think, it's hard to say what a good data set would look like, but I know we're a long way from that. There is some technology out there that I think that certainly we use in keeping track of our own farms, even though we're here on the ground in the Midwest, whether it's satellite imagery or others, to actually understand, well, what does the crop look like in the field, and to try to get a better estimate of yields. It's very difficult, even in the US, to accurately track yields, and if not for crop insurance programs, it would be even more difficult. So when you look to other regions of the world, like South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Eastern Europe, I think it's very difficult. I actually think outside of technology, there'll be no way to solve this. And that'll probably help on the pricing side over time when you have more accurate measures of what's actually being produced. And that should help dampen price volatility. But ultimately, what determines price is what is a buyer willing to pay and what is a seller willing to transact at. Because these are real commodities that have to move around, and they have a shelf life every year. So ultimately, I think data will be helpful to smooth prices, but it won't cure crop cycles and price cycles that happen.
Thank you for that. So we have a very good question here from one of our GIC directors. The Club of Rome's warning of a global food shortage, that was met with the view that advanced genetic improvements could help crop yields. I'm going to ask this question to both of you. Can we anticipate further genetic progress in meeting the food needs of the emerging world? And Dr. Kaufman, maybe you can address this in terms of GMO labeling and any perspective or insight that you have regarding the advancements in genetic engineering for crop yields?
I think there are many advances in crop yield genetically. European countries, generally speaking, are more strict in legislation and in the attitudes of consumer towards genetic modified grains. So I don't know if that would help to give the supply of European countries, but as for the US, it may be helpful. I do see many other trends, not only genetic trends, that may help to balance it, supply and demand, such as vegetarianism that is in Western developed country highly popular today. It is doubling or tripling in comparison to the past, so this is one thing. And we also know about modification and genetics of meat that is actually being really advanced. So if there will be a way to produce meats that do not demand crop and water, that will really help increase the supply in crops for eating for human people, for humans. So that's my perspective on that.
Thank you. Brandon, what's your perspective on genetic technology advancing production and yield?
Yeah, GMO has been a godsend for the world. I think, it's kind of a bad word for a lot of people. They think GMO is something that, should be avoided, and to each his own. But, we grow both GMO and non-GMO crops on our farms, and I could say there's a significant difference in the yields that are produced every year between those two crops and the ability to control weeds and pests and diseases. So I think the world needs GMO. I think the definition of what's acceptable of GMO versus kind of a CRISPR technology is it's a razor's edge. So I think if people actually understood what they were eating, that's a good thing. I think labeling should be done. I think that's a plus for all consumers to know what they eat, how it's produced, and let the consumer make the choice. Particularly in regions of Western Europe, in the United States or North America, consumers should have that choice and have the knowledge. In other parts of the world, they won't have the choice. They want to eat. So eating meat, whether it's grass-fed or grain-fed, more than once a week is an important thing for a lot of people globally who don't have that choice today. So I think increasing production is going to be necessary. It won't just come from genetic modification. The use of technology is huge. More efficient use of resources and inputs, whether it's fertilizer, water, those are all big things that help bring down the cost of production, which brings down the cost of those crops. You doing things with less labor are actually going to be, I think, a huge issue, a huge benefit going forward, because labor is one of those costs in the food system that's not transitory. As labor costs increase, those costs stay for a long, long time. And I think as food prices increase, the percentage of that that's allocated to labor is going to be here, and it's going to keep food prices high. So the move toward more technology, where things are more automated, less hands-on, is actually going to be a benefit overall and will increase yields over time. So I think there'll be a lot of ways to increase yields. It won't just come through genetic modification, but I do think that that's a real thing that it's kind of a high-class problem to have, but there are a lot of places in the world that they would love to have this problem of overproduction.
Terrific. Thank you for that. Dr. Kaufman, this is the perfect question for you, given we are benefiting from the fact that we have an epidemiologist and a nutritionist all wrapped into one. It's a little off topic, but is there any evidence of the role nutrition plays in the coronavirus pandemic, either the impact on being infected or the impact on fighting the coronavirus disease based on nutrition? Care to comment?
Yeah, so a lot of research has actually been conducted on the nutritional status of individuals, and whether or not they were affected more or less with COVID, and what are the outcomes of being infected with COVID. So obviously people that are nutritionally deficient to start with have less resources to cope with an infectious disease. If they lack essential vitamins prior to being infected, their body, their immune system won't be able to fight well with infectious diseases. We've seen a lot of advertising towards take more vitamin D, take more zinc, take more vitamin C, which is not well proved. So people who are not deficient at those vitamins are not known, at least up to date, to benefit from taking extra vitamins, and it doesn't help them. It does help, and that has been proved already, to those people that were deficient to begin with. So if a person was not in a good nutrition status prior to the disease, supplementing him or giving him either food or supplement will help him fight the COVID.
Great, thank you for that. So Brandon, as a fellow CIO, we know that ESG, environmental, social, governance-based investing, is all the rage right now. And it's truly having an impact on a number of industries. The question here is, can you speak to ESG's impact on big farm, big agriculture, as well as the small farmer, and how that's playing out with the contacts that you have through your business?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And as an institutional investor, we see it all the time. I think, some of what is misunderstood in agriculture, when people say farmers, at least in the United States, they paint everyone with the same brush. And the sophistication and the use of technology and kind of those ESG standards that farmers use, it's very wide in terms of the range of that. So part of our diligence as an investor is identifying who are those farmers we want to work with that are already doing a lot of these things. So some of the ESG dynamics that are in place to try to limit use of water, limit use of fertilizer to control runoff, make sure you're using great labor practices and things like that. That's just part and parcel with being in agriculture. If you want to be in the top quartile or top decile, you have to do those things already. So I think a lot of the ESG initiatives, and we're part of one of them called Leading Harvest, is more of a documentation exercise than changing practices, because we're already working with those farmers that have been doing it this way for decades and even longer, for generations. So I think the ESG is really important. I believe in agriculture, the two most scarce resources are soil and water. So everything you can do to protect your soil and also maintain your water resources are really important. I also believe we believe that part of being a good steward in the agricultural space is growing crops in regions where water is actually plentiful, as opposed to depleting resources. So you'll notice while we're in 10 states, we're not in places like California or the desert Southwest. We're not trying to irrigate deserts to grow organic crops. We have something very special here in the Midwest called natural rainfall, and that is the cheapest form of irrigation you can have. It comes with a number of issues, but we believe that investing in areas where you're not depleting natural resources should be really the number one aspect of ESG. And I think that's kind of lost for a lot of people. But going forward, water is the one resource that I think the western part of the United States is getting a good reminder right now that it's scarce and it's very valuable. So we need to take care of it. And obviously, Professor Kaufman would know in Israel, they've been doing that for a long, long time. And a focus on water is huge.
So Dr. Kaufman, there's a question from a participant in Israel. Living in Israel, I note the most traditional foods I eat have red labels. Manufacturers be persuaded to produce healthier snack and cereal and drink alternatives. And I'll wrap this in, but there's several questions here, I think, about the behavioral change of producers and the food companies. Can you just speak to that in terms of the labeling's ability to change the producers, what they're producing and what they're providing to
Yeah,
people?
there is a lot to speak about on this topic, actually. Sitting at the Knesset committee, the House of Representative committee dealing with food labeling, there were manufacturers were really worried on how is it going to influence the consumers. So we had a lot of political or lobbying committees or companies trying to influence politicians to vote or to vote against the new food labeling, and there has been many issues from the food companies lobby. I do know that manufacturers produce whatever they can sell. So if consumers are indifferent towards what in their foods, they will continue manufacturing that, and that's the way it is. I mean, that's what the business is supposed to do. On the other hand, they did try to negotiate with the Ministry of Health on what will receive red labeling, and there were many arguments about this. So what is the exact level of ingredients that is going to receive red labeling has actually changed twice because of the lobbying of those companies. Unfortunately, the people from the academia tried to fight against it, as you may understand. The end point of what received finally the red labeling is not the ideal labeling that we wish to see, but it was a reasonable compromise, I would say. And there are stages that Israel decided upon. So starting from the point where we are at and increasing or restricting the health benefits later on within a year or two, to let consumers, to let productions adapt to the changes that are required. And I would also like to say we live in a global world. As we all know, we receive food items from different countries. There is an open market, so there is also a question of how would you label foods that are not manufactured in your country. So they are supposed to be labeled in the same manner. Manufacturers from Europe came to those committees and tried to say that they will not sell Israel these foods that will supposed to receive red labeling. It didn't happen. Eventually, looking 3 years after, it didn't happen. They continue to sell whatever they sold before. That's it, pretty much. So I think to conclude that, manufacturers will sell whatever they can, and the Ministry of Health should do whatever it can to protect the citizens.
So to that point, and putting the power in the citizens' hands, what would you advise Israelis to do to try to influence government? And what would you encourage US citizens to do to try to influence government policy here?
This is actually a very good question, and we try to ask the audience as a sample of the citizens that we send the survey to, what would you suggest? So surprisingly, I was really surprised in Israel that people suggested we would put taxation on the companies. That means that consumers will need to pay more. So that doesn't make much sense to me as a consumer, that I will need to pay more for crappy food. But it's the same manner that cigarettes or or alcohol is being taxed. That has been a very strong suggestion of the public. I do see that, for instance, in Chicago, when a tax has been imposed on soft drinks, it didn't actually cause the benefit that those who decided on it wanted. What they saw eventually that people of low socioeconomic status continued to buy the soft drinks with a higher tax, so with an overall higher price, and just decreased the intake of healthier foods because they have limited budget. So it wouldn't necessarily target the populations that you want to target. I think that taking the public perspective, we should see who are the populations in our countries that consume most of the unhealthy food, and that the diseases or the burden of diseases that they have is actually contributing or discontributing or damaging the health costs, attributing to the health cost, and target those populations' eating habits. That has a lot to do with education and with explanations and with health literacy that sometimes is very low in segments of the populations that are more affected with health problems.
Great, thank you. So I'm sorry to say we're at the end of our hour. We certainly have a number of other questions. If you asked a question, we were unable to get to it, we'll put those questions to both Dr. Kaufman and Mr. Zick. We'll try to get a response back to you if we can. But Dr. Kaufman and Brandon, thank you for an insightful discussion and for spending time with the GIC community. We really appreciate you being here today. And we hope you'll be able to come back and join us for another program in the near future. But thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
As a reminder, before we close, a replay of today's executive briefing and the slides will be available on the GIC website later today. We are excited to finally announce our first live in-person program for quite some time, since early 2020. And that's going to be with our 13th annual Rocky Mountain Economic Summit that will take place in Victor, Idaho on July 15th, 16th. Registration for that event is available on the GIC website. To learn more about upcoming conferences, additional executive briefings, become a GIC member, or to donate in support of programs like this, please visit our website at www.interdependence.org. As we conclude, we encourage you to respond to our audience survey. Your feedback is very important to us. We appreciate you letting us know how we can improve our programming. Thank you very much for your attention, and have a good day.